I don't know if you've noticed, but we seem to be living in really uncertain times, and there are a lot of voices out there asking people to rip apart the foundations of society and replace those foundations with something else. But what that something else is exactly, nobody ever seems to say. And it turns out some of these deconstructors are building on long forgotten and wrong-headed ideas that go back a really, really long time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau isn't really one of the more popular European philosophers, even though his influence clearly contributed to some of the biggest upheavals of the last few centuries. Not the least of which were the likes of the French Revolution of the late 18th century and the communist overthrow of the Russian czars in 1917. But go get a first-year textbook of Western philosophy and just page your way through it, and you'll find precious little space given to Rousseau. He just isn't a top 40 philosopher. So I thought today, maybe in the spirit of fairness, I'd spend some time talking about Rousseau's contribution to 18th century thought. Not because I like the guy, but because the stuff he wrote kind of forces us to explore the nature of human existence. And it gives me the opportunity to highlight the rather contrary thinking found in the Bible, that other great founding document of Western civilization. Rousseau was born in the city of Geneva, son to a Swiss watchmaker, which of course was a very prestigious trade back in the day. In fact, we still kind of revere Swiss watches and Swiss watchmakers to this day. Other watchmakers from other countries didn't have the same kind of clout because, well, as Rousseau himself once said, a Genevan watchmaker is a man who can be introduced anywhere. A Parisian watchmaker is only fit to talk about watches. Now, I know that seems like kind of a slam against the French, but it's really Rousseau's way of pointing out that his father wasn't just a craftsman, but a thinker and a philosopher. In fact, from a very young age in early boyhood, Rousseau's father taught him to read the ancient classics, and one of his all-time favorites was Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans by Plutarch. He found those stories so fascinating that he would read them to his father while his father was busy at the watchmaking workbench. And sometimes he would even act out the stories, pretending that he was one of those ancient Greek heroes. So Rousseau really had a pretty decent childhood. But then when he was 10, his father was arrested for hunting on a wealthy man's land. And because Dad knew he didn't have the power or the resources to beat this man in court, he suddenly picked up and moved away from the city of Geneva. And personally, I suspect that to some extent it was that episode that contributed to Rousseau's hatred for the wealthy and the privileged, and the way that he thought civilization appeared to be stacked in wealthy people's favor. The budding philosopher was sent to live with somebody else, and to the surprise of the staunch Calvinists he grew up with, he eventually converted to Catholicism. And some people have speculated that he converted, at least in part, because he didn't like the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity, which taught that human beings are born with a sinful nature and do not have the moral resources to redeem themselves. That was an idea that really bothered him. And later, in his famous book, Emile, he wrote this: "Let us lay it down as an incontrovertible rule that the first impulses of nature are always right. There is no original sin in the human heart. The how and why of the entrance of every vice can be traced." What he's saying, essentially, is that he believed human beings are born completely sinless, and then the influence of the world eventually leads us to corruption. In fact, he spent a lot of time praising what he imagined to be our much better existence in the far distant past, in some kind of magical utopia that existed before human beings created awful things like civilization. Now, if you go back to the 19th century and even a little bit earlier, back to Rousseau's day, you'll find lots of people pining for a more natural existence. They wanted to return to what they imagined was a more exalted way of living in the far distant past. One of the more famous examples from more recent times, of course, was the American author Henry Thoreau, who built himself a tiny cabin in the woods and separated himself from everybody else. It's a story you find in this book, Walden. Some of you probably had to read this in college. What Thoreau imagined was that he was separating himself from the slavery of everyday human existence, in part because he didn't have to hold down a job anymore. And near the beginning of this book, here's what he says. I see young men, my townsmen, whose misfortune it is to have inherited farms, houses, barns, cattle, and farming tools, for these are more easily acquired than got rid of. Better if they had been born in the open pasture and suckled by a wolf, that they might have seen with clearer eyes what field they were called to labor in. Who made them? Serfs of the soil. And then we get this depressing statement just a few sentences later. He says, but men labor under a mistake. The better part of the man is soon plowed into the soil for compost. Probably not great reading when you head back to work on a Monday morning. By a seeming fate, he says, they are employed, as it says in an old book, and by that he means the Bible, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt and thieves break through and steal. It is a fool's life, and they will find when they get to the end of it, if not before. Of course, Thoreau is distorting what the Bible actually says, because what Christ is talking about at that point in the Sermon on the Mount is not the act of just working for a living, but making the accumulation of wealth your first priority. What Jesus doesn't say is that you shouldn't go to work, which becomes, well, really obvious if you take the time to read the whole Bible. Now, to be really honest, I like reading this kind of stuff like Walden because I have a soft spot for wilderness adventures. So if you ask me, would I like to live in a cabin like Walden did? Yeah, of course I would. But unfortunately, it'd be hard to do this job from the middle of the wilderness. So you got to wonder, where in the world did Henry Thoreau get such a negative view of modern life and working? Well, you got to admit, he kind of has a point. I mean, the fact that we get paid to go to work reminds us that most of us would rather be doing something else most days. And it reminds us that the book of Genesis is completely right when it says that working hard is, well, part of a curse. But at the same time, the Bible is still full of reminders that hard work has become absolutely necessary now that we no longer live in paradise. Let me show you just a couple of famous examples. Here's one that you find over in the book of Proverbs, where it says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer, and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man." Or what about this one from one of Paul's letters to the Thessalonians? He says, "For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." So, on the one hand, the Bible tells us we have to work because we sinned. And then on the other hand, the Bible tells us that we need to submit to this new way of living and make the most of it because, well, this is the way it's supposed to be right now. So, let's get back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because he actually said that civilization itself is a curse. And I'll be right back after this to show you what he meant when he said that.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
One of Henry Thoreau's major influences, it seems, was the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who utterly lamented the plight of hardworking people when compared to the wealthy landowners who just paid other people to work for them. So Rousseau spent a lot of time trying to imagine how this situation came to be. And on one occasion, when the Academy at Dijon in France put on an essay contest, he suddenly had this major epiphany. It was 1749, and the contestants had to answer this question in an essay: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? Here's what they were asking. People realized that Europe was now busy clawing its way out of the Dark Ages, which began when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And they were wondering if a return to classical ancient learning was actually some kind of benefit to society. And most people would have said yes, but not Rousseau. When he saw that ad in the paper, he went out for a walk to think about his answer. And that's when he came to this conclusion: society was not getting better, and civilization was a massive problem for humanity. That idea became one of his first books, called The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. And then a few years later, he expanded those same ideas and wrote his most important work of political philosophy, his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality Among Men. I have both books in one volume. And this is kind of where things start to get, well, weird. What Rousseau does is travel back in time to imagine a world where people are basically animals. It's kind of like the theory of evolution, even though it predates Darwin by about 100 years. The truth is that lots of people have been toying with the idea of evolution for a really long time, in fact, for centuries. And what Darwin did in the 19th century was come up with a mechanism to explain how evolution could happen: the process of natural selection and survival of the fittest. What Rousseau did long before Darwin was travel back through time in his imagination to this wonderful world where he said people live much better lives. All we had to think about back then, before civilization, was where to find food. And just like the animals, our lives were simple and absolutely free. And he said the reason for that was because we didn't actually need each other. If your instincts drove you to procreate, you just did it. You didn't have to get married. If someone ate all the food in one location, you just picked up and went somewhere else. And way back when, in this imaginary paradise, people didn't get sick. And Rousseau said they were naturally compassionate and kind. What he came up with was almost a caveman's version of the Garden of Eden. But of course, it never actually existed. What happened, Rousseau said, was that eventually we started to cooperate with each other. And then we built communities. And then at some point, somebody accumulated more than he actually needed for himself. And then he got the idea that owning stuff was pretty beneficial. And presto, we were suddenly plunged into the depravity of civilization, which did nothing but help out a few powerful people. Rousseau explained that we can lay the blame for all of our human suffering at the feet of whoever invented the concept of private property. And that's a theme that you still hear circulating to this day. Rousseau said that we eventually suppressed our natural compassion for each other and used logic and reason to justify our violence and cruelty against each other. We became philosophers, rationalizers, and that, he said, was the beginning of everything bad. Here's the way Rousseau said it back in the 1750s. He wrote, "It is philosophy that isolates him and bids him say at the sight of the misfortunes of others, 'Perish if you will, I am secure.' A murder may be with impunity committed under his window. He has only to put his hands to his ears and argue a little with himself to prevent nature, which is shocked within him, from identifying itself with the unfortunate sufferer." And on and on and on he goes. And what Rousseau basically argues is that communities and civilization became tools in the hands of powerful oppressors. Civilization, he said, ruined the human race, and now millions of people have become slaves to the powerful. In one of his most famous lines, Rousseau wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Now, I'm sure you've had the odd day where you feel like that when you go to work, because there is something about working for a living that feels just a little like slavery. But what I want you to notice now is how back in the 18th century, Rousseau is actually anticipating a train of thought that would create some of the biggest upsets in human history. His ideas helped fuel the violence of the French Revolution. After all, the revolutionaries believed they were overthrowing a system that was holding them down. It also anticipated Karl Marx, who argued that civilization had to be ripped down and replaced by a system that favored the working class. Those ideas came from Rousseau, at least in part, because what Rousseau wanted to do was rip apart the foundations of civilization so we could return to this imaginary state of pure nature he had dreamed up in his imagination. But let's be honest about this. The French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, they were abysmal failures that quickly devolved into more violence and more oppression. Because it turns out, human beings are incapable of changing their essential selfish nature. Now, I know that some of you are wondering where in the world I'm going to go with this. And if you're patient, I'm going to take a quick break and then I'll come back and show you where we're going. Because even though the French Revolution was a bloody, violent spectacle, and the Soviet Union ultimately failed, some of Rousseau's thinking lives on to this very day. So don't go away. I'll be right back.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
When Rousseau was done expounding on the ridiculous idea that our ancient caveman ancestors, our animal ancestors, were somehow more pure and more compassionate than we are, well, he sent a copy of his brand new book to the famous skeptic Voltaire. And of course, Voltaire was known for being rather biting in his criticism of other people. So here's what Voltaire said in reply to the book. "I have received, sir, your new book against the human species, and I thank you for it. No one has ever been so witty as you are in trying to turn us into brutes," or in other words, back to our primitive animal existence. "To read your book," Voltaire said, "makes one long to go on all fours. As, however, it is now some 60 years since I gave up the practice, I feel that it is unfortunately impossible for me to resume it." In other words, Voltaire found this idea that human civilization was the cause of all our problems ridiculous. Now, that's not to say that oppression doesn't happen in civilization or that powerful people don't take advantage of others, because, well, they absolutely do. We all know that. But the idea that all of us would be better if we just took away the rules of civilization, that's a preposterous and dangerous idea. This idea that our ancestors were peace-loving primitives who were pure and innocent flies in the face of absolutely everything we know. Just because there are aspects of our civilization that definitely are problematic, that doesn't really mean that the essential problem is the civilization itself. The real problem, according to the authors of the Bible, is human nature. Rousseau would like us to believe that human beings in their natural state are completely innocent. But the Bible comes a lot closer to reality. Psalm 51 is a poetic masterpiece that King David wrote after he'd been caught committing adultery and then committing murder to cover his tracks. And this psalm doesn't spend much time talking about how powerful and privileged David was, even though those things were obviously a factor in his guilt. Now, instead, David points to a much more foundational problem, and he writes this: "For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." The real problem in this world is not that we sin against each other, even though we most certainly do that. And there's little question that the prophet Nathan did underscore David's power and privilege when he came to confront him over what he'd done. There's also very little question that God warned the Israelites at the very beginning, don't you ask for a king, because kings do have a way of oppressing people. But at the end of the day, the real problem, the essential foundational problem in this world is us. And by that I mean all of us. Power just has a way of magnifying the problem that we all have. Rousseau insisted that you and I were born completely innocent, but David says he was conceived in sin and brought forth in iniquity. So here's where I'm going to go with this. I mean, I could probably go in 100 different directions because, well, the Bible really does speak about oppression by powerful people. And it does condemn those powerful people who take advantage of the poor. It does it in no uncertain terms. The Bible also spends a lot of time contrasting the fallen kingdoms or fallen civilizations that humanity built in this world, and it compares them with the ultimate kingdom of Christ. So we'll give Rousseau partial marks today for at least noticing that something is wrong with the way that human beings run this place. In fact, that's really one of the major themes you find all the way through the Bible. It says that the human race is divided into two groups. There's a group that tries to rebuild paradise by itself, building cities, and there's another group that seeks to be part of the kingdom of God. One stream builds walled cities, centers of civilization, where powerful people offer peace and protection in exchange for what amounts to, well, labor slavery, kind of like Rousseau described. The other stream seeks communion with God and understands that the human heart is the real source of all of our suffering, and that you and I are completely powerless to change what's wrong with us. So I guess what I'm getting at is this. If we want to take Rousseau's word for it, then all of our problems are actually caused by somebody else. Somebody else, he says, ruined your natural innocence. The reason you're unhappy and life is hard is because somebody else did that to you. If only those other people didn't exist, he says, then life would finally be happy. And I guess what bothers me about this is that I'm hearing more and more of that same kind of talk right now as the world gets more and more polarized. What we seem to have right now is a return to this idea that there's nothing wrong with me and that there's something wrong with everybody else. It's everybody else's corruption that's ruining this place. It's the system that's keeping me down. If only all those powerful, privileged people were suddenly gone, then life could return to a pure, natural state and we could all be equal and my natural goodness could shine. Except we all know, instinctively, that's a bunch of baloney. People are not naturally good. I mean, there's no doubt that a worldly system constructed by selfish people is going to be wildly imperfect. And there's little doubt that when you give selfish people a little bit of power, they're almost always going to abuse it. I mean, just look at the former Soviet Union. It's Exhibit A for the writings of Karl Marx. Back in 1917, revolutionaries seized power and they took it away from the royal family, from the one-percenters, I guess you could say. But then in a remarkably short span of time, those same revolutionaries accumulated all that same power for themselves. And you suddenly had millions of people living worse lives than they did before, while members of the party leadership drove around in nice cars and lived in great homes. Eventually, people were even persecuted and executed simply for what they believed. Political dissidents were sent to the gulags in Siberia. And all that really happened there was a shift in abuse of power. And that's because the real problem on this planet never changes. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Build all the man-made solutions for inequality and suffering that you want, and the essential problem is still there. It's a broken human heart. That's what Rousseau and countless others have failed to understand. It's the fact that you and I, all of us, are fallen human beings and we can't solve our worst problems. Here's how the Apostle Paul described it. He said, "For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. Oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" In other words, he says, I want to be good, but I can't change my essential nature. This utopia that Rousseau imagined, this place where primitive people live pure, peaceful lives, it's a myth. I mean, there was a paradise at one point, but we ruined it. And the fallout from our rebellion against our Creator is a broken human heart, so tainted by sin that you're powerless to change it. No law, no government, no political ideology is going to fix it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't participate in civilization, because even though human government is not a great substitute for the kingdom of God, it's all we've got right now, and we have an obligation to the best of our ability to live with what we built. For the most part, the laws we've created are there to make a peaceful coexistence somewhat possible. And by and large, our system of civilization mostly exists to contain the problem of a fallen heart. Until Christ returns, this is what we've got. So it bothers me when I hear voices calling for the utter deconstruction of Western civilization. It bothers me that we appear to be one of the most intolerant, unforgiving generations to ever walk the earth, and we always want to blame somebody else for everything. So what would happen if all of us owned it together? What if we could admit that we're all part of the problem? What appears to be happening right now is kind of a radical deconstruction, the kind that fueled the French Revolution, the kind that was born on the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. People seem to be mindlessly ripping everything down without thinking it through. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is something wrong with this world, and we shouldn't turn a blind eye to injustice, but what's happening right now should concern us, because we're ripping things down without asking ourselves why it was built in the first place, and nobody talks about what they plan to replace it with. And when we're finished ripping apart our basic civilization, we're going to find out we still haven't solved the biggest problem, the sinful heart. And until we solve that, we solve absolutely nothing. Paul complains that he can't fix what's wrong with him, and he says, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" And then he gives the answer. "I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin." Believe me, God has noticed the injustice, the problems with our world, and He's promised to dissolve human government completely and restore the kingdom of Christ, where we all get restored, in a place the Bible says lives by God's commandments, not human commandments. And that's when the problem is finally solved. I'm Shawn Boonstra. You've been watching Authentic.